In the bitter winter of 1901, Massachusetts felt older than the nation itself, as if the forests had carried centuries of whispers and grief long before colonists ever raised their churches along the coast. The cold that year was vicious, biting at chimneys, crawling under doors, peeling paint from window frames. Every old house seemed to creak with a deep, aching memory. Nestled between the Charles River and the pine-thick hills stood the small township of Ashford Hollow, a place so modest that even the regional maps often forgot it. The town had a schoolhouse with frost-warped boards, a church whose bell rope frayed every winter, a textile mill that chewed up men's lungs, and a row of houses whose lanterns flickered in unison when the wind crawled through the valley. But the people, they always remembered one name, Dr. Elias Wren, and they remembered the winter he arrived, the winter the dead began to feel heavier. Ashford Hollow had never been a place where rumors spread fast. The townsfolk were too tired, too occupied with survival. But the day Dr. Wren rode into town in a horse-drawn carriage as black as an undertaker's vest, even the mill foreman looked up from his ledger. He stepped out into the snow with his boots barely leaving a print, like the earth itself was reluctant to acknowledge him. He wore a long charcoal coat that hung from his shoulders like a funeral shroud, and he carried a physician's bag of polished leather, the buckles gleaming like small, metallic eyes. His spectacles were rimless, thin as frost on a pane, and behind them his eyes were an unsettling shade of pale gray, the color of storm clouds deciding whether or not to thunder. He introduced himself simply. Dr. Elias Wren, physician. I will be setting up practice at the residence on Marrow Street. Marrow Street. Even the name sounded wrong. The house he purchased had belonged to a widower who simply left, walking away from his home one dawn in late November and never being seen again. Some townsfolk believed he had gone to Boston to chase work. Others suspected the river had swallowed him. But no one entered that house after he vanished, not even to collect what he left behind. Yet Dr. Wren inspected it without hesitation. He touched the window frames with bare fingers. He tapped the floorboards with the tip of a cane. He wandered room to room as if he were listening not to the timber beneath him, but to something unseen that responded in whispers. Mrs. Holland, the widow who lived across from the Wren property, watched from behind her lace curtain. Years later, she would tell investigators, he looked like a man being guided by someone else, someone standing beside him, even though he stood alone. The house welcomed him in a way that felt unnatural, and from that first evening, the strange lamp in his upstairs window glowed long after midnight, moving slightly, as if carried from one end of the room to the other. Life in Ashford Hollow had always been somber, but that winter, a heaviness settled over the streets that people couldn't explain. The air felt too still. The forests, normally loud with pine sparrows, fell silent. Even the river, the Charles, froze smooth and clear. So clear that townspeople claimed they could see stones resting on the riverbed like ancient coins. But no one walked on that ice. They all said the same thing. It feels wrong beneath your feet, like something is watching. The textile mill, which usually hammered and clattered all day, began to suffer strange outages. Lanterns dimmed without explanation. Men reported seeing shapes in the dust clouds rising from the looms. And the cold. The cold seemed to grow teeth. Ashford Hollow had never been prosperous, but it had always been alive. Yet with the arrival of Dr. Wren, a quiet dread began to seep into the bones of the town, the kind of dread that makes a person wake at 3 a.m. without knowing why. Elias Wren worked late, long after every lantern in town was blown out. People passing by his house on their way home from the night shift would hear it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of metal on metal, soft but rhythmic, like a heartbeat trying to keep pace with something unnatural. It was the sound of a scale, every night, every single night. At first, the town assumed he was simply a peculiar man. Most physicians were. They dealt with death too often not to be shaped by it. But Dr. Wren did not behave like a man acquainted with death. He behaved like a man courting it. He was polite too. Polite, speaking with precise, clipped tones, as if every word had been scrubbed clean of emotion before leaving his mouth. He never smiled. Not once. But his manner wasn't cold in the usual way. It was more like he carried his warmth elsewhere, as if his affections were saved for someone, or something. Unseen. And then there were the questions. Odd questions. The kind no normal doctor would ask when Mrs. Breyer came in with her infant son, coughing from the mill dust. The doctor did not ask about diet or sleep or symptoms. He asked, "Does he ever stare at corners of the room as though he sees someone standing there?" When old Mr. Cartwright visited complaining of chest pain, the doctor asked, "In the moments before you sleep, do you feel yourself drifting away from your body? Not in dream, but as if something beckons you?" And when Lydia Warren, the first of the strange casualties, was brought to him, he asked her mother, "Has she ever awakened speaking words she does not remember learning?" Not medical questions. Not practical questions. Questions that chilled the bone. If adults found Dr. Wren unsettling, children found him terrifying. The boys who played corkball near the mill stopped using Marrow Street entirely. They claimed the shadows around his house moved too much, like thin arms stretching just beyond the corner of the eye. The smallest of the boys, Thomas Redley, swore that when he walked past the doctor's house one dusk, he saw someone standing in the upstairs window, someone without a face. His father beat him for lying. But the boy never walked that road again. Another child, Maggie Harlow, said she heard whispering coming from the doctor's porch even though no one was there. The wind wasn't blowing that afternoon. The trees were still. But the whispers reached her like a breath pressed directly against her ear. And then there was the lamp that never went out. Every night, its soft orange glow would shift from one end of the upper room to the other, not flickering, but gliding, as if held in a steady hand. But the doctor lived alone, or so the town believed. One of the most haunting early testimonies came from Edna Holland, the widow who lived across the street. Unlike most, she was not afraid to look through her window after dark. She had lost too much in life to be frightened by shadows, but even she admitted, "That house unnerved me more than any graveyard I've ever walked through." In late January of that year, she claimed to see Dr. Wren standing outside his home at nearly 2 a.m. He didn't wear a coat despite the brutal cold. He was barefoot, his toes pressed into the snow as if he felt nothing. He stared up at the sky, not at the stars, but at a single patch of blackness where the clouds gathered without shape. He whispered something along low string of syllables she had never heard before. Not English, not Latin, not anything she recognized. She pulled her curtain aside further and gasped aloud. Standing beside him was a second shape, not clearly human. UNOVING. Featureless. She blinked once. Hard, and the shape was gone, but Dr. Wren remained, still whispering to the sky. She wrote in her private journal that night, "I fear the doctor communes with something that does not fear God." That entry would later be entered into official evidence by February. Multiple workers from the Ashford Hollow Textile Company approached Sheriff Burke with complaints regarding the doctor. They said he watched them when they left the mill. He didn't smile. He didn't greet them. He didn't even seem curious. He simply watched, not with interest, but with assessment, like a farmer selecting which livestock looked most promising. One worker, Elias Granford, no relation to Dr. Wren, claimed he saw the doctor pressing his fingers to the throat of a dead crow lying on Marrow Street, muttering, "Even hollow vessels leave residue." Granford never took that road again. He walked 2 miles out of his way each morning. Another worker, named Reuben Kent, claimed the doctor once stopped him to ask a question, so strange he could barely recount it without trembling. "When you dream of the dead, Do they weigh more or less than the living? Reuben quit the mill the following week. All of these accounts were dismissed as paranoia at first. But dread was growing. Like mold in the dark, before Lydia's death, the death that would expose the first crack in reality. She told her mother something the night before she collapsed. She whispered, "Mama, when Dr. Wren looked at me today, it felt like he was measuring something." Mary Warren assumed she meant measuring her breathing, her cough, her pain, but Lydia shook her head and lowered her voice. "Not my breathing, not my body. Something inside me." Her mother hushed her, saying illness often brought strange thoughts. But Lydia wasn't delirious. She was afraid. And 2 days later, dogs refused to pass the Wren house. Horses pulling wagons would suddenly balk and refuse to move. Cats hissed at the doctor's gate, their backs arching so violently, their fur shed in clumps. Nature recognized something the people were trying desperately to ignore. Something lived in that house, something that wasn't human. Something Dr. Wren was nurturing, studying, or obeying. And every night, that scale kept tapping. On the last night of February, when the moon was a thin sickle of white, a sound echoed over Ashford Hollow that no one could explain. A second tapping, not the doctor's scale, heavier, slower, deeper. Like something enormous shifting its weight in the attic of the Wren house. It went on for nearly a minute, and then stopped. Abruptly. Like a breath sucked inward. Mrs. Holland, pale with dread, whispered the words she would later repeat to the sheriff. It sounded like something learning how to walk. And that was before the first disappearance, before the ledger came to light, before the doctor himself vanished into thin air. Ashford Hollow had no idea that the true horror had not yet begun, but it was coming, and it had weight. The night Lydia Warren collapsed, the snowfall had stopped abruptly, leaving the world muffled as if someone had placed a quilt over the entire town. The moonlight made the road glitter like crushed glass. Lydia walked home from choir practice, clutching a hymnal to her chest, her breath rising in small white clouds. She had been quiet for days, not sick, just distant. Her friends said she stared too long at doorways and paused on the street corners as if listening for a call no one else could hear. She left the church around 7 p.m. By 7:10, she was coughing blood into the snow. 2 boys found her kneeling in the road, her hands shaking violently as she covered her mouth. The blood steamed as it hit the freezing air. She whispered, her voice raw, "Don't let him measure me." The boys ran for help, and within minutes, Dr. Wren was on the scene. He knelt beside her, pressing his fingertips to her throat with an unsettling calm. And then he said something no one forgot. "We still have time." Not "she'll be all right," not "get her inside." Just that gentle, cold reassurance, spoken as if he were timing something only he could hear. He lifted her with surprising strength, carrying her toward the Warren home. But as he passed under the lamplight, the boys saw something strange. His shadow did not match his body. His legs walked, but the shadow's legs dragged. His head remained still, but the shadow's head turned, as if watching them. The boys never mentioned it again, not until years later, when investigators came knocking. Hungry for forgotten truths, Lydia died before dawn. Her mother recalled how the doctor stayed by the bedside long after the girl's breathing had stopped, staring at the stillness with a fascination that made Mary Warren tremble. He did not comfort her. He did not look away. He simply observed. Finally he whispered, "It is leaving." But slowly, the young clung to their bodies. Mary Warren gasped and stepped back. The doctor reached into his bag, not for medicine, but for a small brass scale, thin as a spider web, delicate enough to fit on a tea saucer. He placed it on the nightstand beside Lydia's head. Before Mary could speak, he whispered again, "Quiet, it listens." And then something horrifying happened. The scale moved. The brass dish lifted slightly, trembling as if stirred by a breeze, though the house was sealed tight, the windows shut. and the lantern flame held steady. Mary Warren screamed and slapped the scale from the table. It clattered across the floor, ringing like a tiny bell. Dr. Wren's expression did not change. He merely retrieved the scale, brushing it off like a treasured instrument, and he recorded a number he did not write in the official death ledger, but in a slip of paper tucked into his coat. Subject 3, 0.75 ounces. This slip would later be discovered stained with something black darker than ink, thicker than tar. Within 24 hours. Ashford Hollow was trembling with whispers. Lydia's sudden death was strange enough, but it was the morning after that sent panic rippling through the valley when the undertaker arrived to prepare Lydia's body. He found something unusual. Her lungs were clear, her veins unmarked, her heart pristine. No disease. No injury, nothing to explain her death. He muttered under his breath. She died of fear. But that wasn't the strangest part. The undertaker said her body felt heavier than it should, as if someone had placed stones inside her limbs. It took 2 men to lift her, a girl barely 75 pounds in life, and around her lips was a faint ring of frost, as if her last breath had been pulled out of her like smoke from a chimney. The undertaker swore he heard something in the room with him, a whisper, low and resentful, measured. He left Ashford Hollow before the end of the month. He refused to speak of that night again, 4 days after Lydia's burial. Another strange event shook the town. A mill worker named Jonas Dalrymple vanished. He was last seen walking home along Marrow Street, a route he took every night. Snow covered most footprints by morning, but that day, there was one clear trail, Jonas's boots, leading toward Dr. Wren's house. Just beyond the doctor's front gate. The prints stopped abruptly. 2 boots were found neatly placed beside the door. As if the man stepped out of them and walked barefoot into the house. But the doctor insisted he hadn't seen Jonas. He stood in his doorway that morning, calm as a winter pond, and said, "You'll find him when his weight is ready." Sheriff Burke bristled. "Wait?" Dr. Wren simply nodded. Double quotes, "Everything leaves a measure behind, even absence." No one knew what that meant. Not yet. Elsie Marrow, a 13-year-old mill girl, kept a diary the townsfolk found after her disappearance months later. The last surviving pages contained some of the most chilling early accounts of the doctor's interactions with what she called the shadow that stands beside him. She wrote, February 23 RDI saw the doctor today through his upstairs window. He was talking to someone, but no one was there. The lamp moved while his hands stayed still. Another entry, February 25, his house makes no sound except that tapping. Mama says it's his scale, but I've tapped scales my whole life in the mill. They do not sound like something breathing. And the final entry, before she stopped writing for weeks, February 28, he walked home past his house. There were 2 shadows in the window, only one man lives there. Elsie's diary became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation years later. When anyone dared speak of Ashford Hollow's horrors again, in early March, the town experienced something no one could explain. Night after night, from between the trees behind Dr. Wren's house, villagers heard voices chanting. Always the same 2 voices. One was unmistakably Dr. Wren's calm, measured, rhythmic. But the other voice made the blood run cold. It was wet. Gurgling. Like someone speaking through water or thick mud. A farmer named Reuben Kent, who lived closest to the woods, claimed he heard the same phrase repeated. Release the measure. Retain the rest. His wife told him it was the wind, but Reuben insisted. The wind does not choke on its own words. The chanting continued for 30 nights. On the 14th night, silence returned. Almost too much silence, as if the woods were holding their breath. Sheriff Thomas Burke was not an imaginative man. He believed in facts. Not gossip. He had seen murders, accidents, and the occasional family tragedy. Nothing supernatural. But even he felt the tension tightening across Ashford Hollow. He visited Dr. Wren under the pretense of checking on Jonas Dalrymple's disappearance. The doctor welcomed him. Inside, the house was immaculate but strangely empty. There were no family photos, no mementos, no books that suggested personal interest. Just medical texts, jars of preserved specimens, and a single, unervingly clean scale on the center table. Sheriff Burke asked, "You hear anything strange in the woods at night?" Dr. Wren smiled for the first time, a thin, brittle smile that did not reach his eyes. "Yes." Burke waited, expecting elaboration. But the doctor said nothing more. He walked to the window and touched the glass with 2 fingers. "It watches me." The sheriff's hand hovered near his holster, though he couldn't explain why. "What watches you?" he asked. The doctor's pale gray eyes reflected the street lamps outside, the part that wishes to be. "Wade." Burke left the house with a pounding heart and a feeling. He could not shake a feeling that the doctor had not been alone in that room. 3 days after Burke's visit, a letter circulated through the mill workers, a letter found pinned to the inside of Jonas Dalrymple's abandoned locker. It was written in a shaky hand, smudged with some dark substance, and signed only with the initials J.D. The letter read, "I feel myself drifting. He says it is normal. He says the soul grows lighter before death, but mine feels heavier. He stands beside me even when he is not in the room. The scale moves when I breathe. I think he is waiting for me to stop." The sheriff confiscated the letter, but rumors spread like wildfire, especially when Worker whispered, "That wasn't Jonas's handwriting." By mid-March, the air around the Wren house grew colder than the rest of town. Children said you could see your breath 3 houses away, even when the weather warmed. People walking past claimed the shadows around the porch seemed to stretch longer than they should, drifting toward the street like reaching fingers, and neighbors swore they heard footsteps pacing upstairs. Heavy, measured footsteps. But whenever anyone knocked on the door, Dr. Wren answered immediately, and he was always alone. Always. One night, shortly after midnight, Mrs. Holland woke to a soft glow seeping through her bedroom curtains. At first, she thought it was moonlight, but the color was wrong, too pale, too steady. She stepped to the window and gasped. The upstairs window of Dr. Wren's house was lit with a strange, bluish-white radiance, unlike any lamp or flame she had ever seen. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, and then she saw it, a silhouette. Not of the doctor, something taller, something hunched, something with shoulders too broad and a head that brushed the ceiling. It stood beside the doctor, who held a candle in his trembling hand. The doctor bowed his head. The shadow leaned close to him. And the candle flame bent toward the shadow, not from wind, but as though being pulled. Mrs. Holland clapped her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. By the time she dared look again, the light was gone, but the tapping of a scale echoed through the night. Tap, tap, tap. Measured. Weighed. Recorded. And the true horror was only beginning. The revelation did not begin with a scream, a disappearance, or a corpse, but with a creak. On the evening of March 17th, during another sudden cold snap, a thunderous crack sounded throughout Ashford Hollow. It rolled across the valley like cannon fire and shook frost from the window panes. But the sound wasn't from the river ice, nor from the trees splitting in the cold. It came from the doctor's house. Neighbors ran into the street, lanterns in hand, and saw the upper window of the Wren home flash with a brief, unnatural light, bluish-white, too bright to be a lamp, too steady to be lightning. Then silence. Not ordinary silence, but the kind of silence that makes the ears ache. As if the world has suddenly forgotten how to breathe. Two boys walked toward the house to investigate. But the moment they stepped onto the doctor's lawn, an awful pressure pressed against their chests, heavy enough to steal their breath. They staggered back, gasping, noses bleeding. Whatever had happened inside that house, it was powerful enough to push the living away. By morning, word spread quickly. Dr. Wren had not emerged from his home since the night before. Sheriff Burke saw no choice. He gathered 2 deputies, a blacksmith, and the pastor, and marched up Marrow Street with a warrant to search the premises. What they found inside would never leave their memories. Wren House was freezing, not winter cold, but morgue cold. The kind that clings to bone and sinks into the marrow. Their lanterns flickered the moment they crossed the threshold, flames shrinking as if suffocating under some invisible weight. Sheriff Burke called out, "Dr. Wren?" No answer. They moved through the parlor, the hallway, the dining room. Every surface gleamed with unnatural cleanliness, but the air felt raw and dense, heavy, like walking through water. The sheriff's breath clouded. "This ain't natural," one deputy whispered. In the study, they found the scale. Small. Brass. Clean. And still moving. The plates trembled gently, though the windows were closed. And no wind stirred. The pastor whispered a prayer. The scale seemed to respond, the plates rising slightly, as though acknowledging the word God with quiet defiance. Burke gritted his teeth, spread out. "We're finding him." But the doctor was nowhere. Not upstairs. Not downstairs. Not in the basement. Only when the blacksmith, Hal Drury, knocked over a jar of preserved organs did the sheriff hear it. A hollow clunk beneath the floorboards. As if something small, metal, heavy, had shifted with the vibration. Burke dropped to his knees, pried the floorboard loose, and pulled out a leather-bound book stained with something dark and brittle. A ledger. Dr. Wren's ledger. The first page was neat, noticeably neater than the frantic scrawl of the later entries. It read, "Subject 1. Jonathan Carver, lungs weak from mill dust, heart steady. Soul responsive. Recorded weight 1.25 ounces. Below this was a diagram. Human silhouette with a faint gray smudge drawn near the chest. Labeled, area of greatest resistance during final exhalation. Pastor Arnold murmured. He wasn't treating them, he was studying them. The sheriff turned the page. More entries. More measurements. Dates. Names. Some of the people listed had died naturally. Others had not, but all were described with clinical fascination, not as patients, but as specimens. The last line of the second entry made the hair rise on Burke's neck. Death loosens the soul, but something else tightens its grip. He didn't know what that meant. Not yet. When they reached Lydia's entry, the deputy, Peter Grant, stepped back in horror. Her page was different. The handwriting dissolved into a trembling script. The ink darker than before, almost black. It read, Subject 3, Lydia Warrenage, 16 symptoms. None consistent behavior, fixation on empty spaces. Reports of unseen presence. Recorded weight, 0.75 ounces. Observation, weight fluctuated. Something resisted measurement. Underneath this was a shaky line. "It touched the scale," Grant whispered. "Touched it? How? She was dead." Pastor Arnold closed his eyes. He wasn't alone when he recorded that weight. The air seemed to darken around them. The next pages abandoned medical formality entirely. The handwriting devolved into jagged lines, frantic loops, and smeared ink. The words ran into each other, slanted across the margins, written in a way that suggested the doctor was writing while his hand shook violently. Fragments read, "The soul clings like oil. It fears the dark behind it. Something steps through the moment they exhale. Weight increases in the presence of the observer. The observer grows eager." In one entry, he wrote, The soul does not rise. It falls. Burke thought that was bad enough until they reached a page so scribbled, so tormented. It looked as though the ink had been scraped into the paper. The title, Subject 4, but no name, just a smear of ink. And beneath it, does not remain dead, requests. Weighing, follows me. Follows the breath, follows the light. Deputy Grant dropped the ledger in terror. The sheriff picked it up with trembling fingers. At the back of the ledger was a folded sheet of paper, a letter addressed to the Massachusetts Medical Society, dated June 6, 1901. The letter was unfinished. It began normally enough, with observations on terminal respiration and post-mortem rigidity. But the tone shifted sharply halfway through. The writing became desperate, shaky, broken. I have discovered that the soul hesitates before departure, not from attachment, but from fear. Another line, it fears what stands behind it. Burke swallowed. Behind it? What's behind it? The deputy whispered. The next sentence answered. A collector. The word was underlined 3 times. Dr. Wren continued. The collector does not take the soul. It weighs it, measures it, judges it. Ink splatters followed, as though the pen tore through the paper mid-stroke. Then the final line smeared, almost illegible. It waits beside me now. I hear its breathing in the walls. I no longer know whose shadow I cast. The letter ended abruptly. The sheriff closed the ledger, his hands shaking. We need to search the rest of the house. They moved room to room, but nothing seemed out of place. Until they reached the upstairs hallway. The dust on the floor, thick from weeks of neglect, was marked with footprints. Not the doctor's, not any humans. They were long, narrow, and placed with uncanny precision, almost symmetrical, as if whatever made them walked with deliberate, measured intent. And there was something even stranger. Every print pointed toward the doctor's study, but none pointed away. As if something had entered the room, but never left. Pastor Arnold whispered, Lord preserve us. In the study, something else caught their eye. A mirror, tall, old, rimmed with tarnished silver. It did not belong there. The doctor's house was nearly devoid of personal effects. The mirror's surface was cloudy, as though fogged from within. Deputy Grant wiped it with his sleeve. The sheriff felt his blood run cold. There were 2 reflections, his own, and behind him, a tall, hunched, shadow-like figure, with no face. Grant yelped and spun around. The room was empty. But in the mirror, the shadow remained. It lifted one hand slowly, as if pressing against glass from the other side. Grant screamed and covered the mirror with a cloth. Breathing hard, the sheriff forced his voice steady. Something is in this house with U.S., something that answers to the doctor's call. Near the mirror, a dark stain marred the wooden boards. Not blood, not ink, something thicker. Something that glistened like oil but smelled faintly metallic. The blacksmith knelt to examine it. This ain't blood. Burke crouched beside him. What then? The blacksmith's face paled. It's heavier. He touched it with the tip of a knife. The blade bent, not from pressure, but as if the substance itself was pulling it downward, dragging it, weighting it. Burke stood abruptly. We're leaving. Now. But as they turned, the floorboard behind them creaked slowly, deliberately, like someone stepping into the room. The scale downstairs chimed suddenly. Tap, 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 tap. Burke whispered, It knows we found the ledger. They fled the house. Only the pastor dared speak once they reached the street. The doctor wasn't measuring souls. He was measuring something else. Burke nodded grimly, and it was measuring him back. That night, the sheriff locked the ledger in his desk drawer, but it didn't stay locked. Around midnight, he heard it, a faint tapping. Not from outside. Not from the window. From inside his desk. He lit a lantern with shaking hands. and opened the drawer. The ledger lay open. A fresh line of writing had appeared darker than any ink he had seen. It read, Subject 5, Sheriff Thomas Burke, wait pending. And the scale in Dr. Wren's house chimed faintly in the distance, even though no human hand touched it. The revelation had been made. The collector had taken notice. And Ashford Hollow would never be the same. 3 nights after the sheriff uncovered the ledger, the town sank into a deeper cold than it had ever known. A cold that did not feel like winter. It felt like the air itself was being drained, hollowed, made thinner. The lanterns along Ashford Hollow's roads flickered dimly. Dogs whimpered. Horses stamped nervously, their breath coming in harsh plumes. And then a soft tapping echoed through Marrow Street. Tap, 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 like a spoon, gently striking glass. People leaned out of their windows. Doors cracked open. Children peered from behind curtains. Every face turned to the coast. Wren House. The upstairs window glowed. The lamp, dark since the sheriff's intrusion, flickered back to life, and a silhouette moved behind the curtains. The doctor had returned. Or so they hoped. A woman exclaimed, He's alive, he must be. But her husband grabbed her wrist. That isn't him. The silhouette was wrong. Too tall, too wide, too still. It did not move like a man, but like a reflection forced through the body of one. More residents crept into the street, pulling scarves tighter, clutching rosaries, holding lanterns that dazzled faintly through the choking cold. The shape in the window leaned forward. And then a second silhouette appeared beside it, shorter, bent. Familiar. The doctor. His shoulders were hunched as if he were being pulled by marionette strings. The two shadows stood together in perfect stillness. Then the taller one raised a hand, long, narrow, like the limb of something starved, and pointed at the street below. A single lantern burst in a shower of sparks. People screamed, and the tapping grew louder. Tap, 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 but it wasn't coming from the window, or the house, or even the street. It was inside people's heads, deep in their skulls, rattling behind their eyes. A sound that did not echo in the air, but in the soul. The exhumation of Lydia Warren the next day. The sheriff made a decision he'd long dreaded. He ordered Lydia Warren's grave exhumed. The priest protested. The mother fainted twice. The undertaker refused to attend. But Burke insisted. Whatever is happening started with her. We need to know. 6 men dug through frozen earth until their fingers cracked and bled. When they lifted the coffin lid, steam rose into the cold air. Warm steam, rising from something that should have been frozen solid. Lydia's body was not decayed. Her skin was pale but intact. Her eyes were closed. Her hands folded neatly over her stomach. But her limbs were stiff, not like a corpse, but like a statue. The sheriff touched her wrist and nearly dropped her arm. She was heavy. Far heavier than any human body should be. As if stone had filled her veins. As if gravity gripped her harder than the earth itself. The deputy stammered, This ain't natural." The sheriff leaned closer and saw it, a faint bruise around her lips. "Not purple, not blue, black as tar, he whispered to the priest. "What does this mean?" The priest crossed himself. "It means something took her breath and kept it." Burke lifted Lydia's body with shaking arms, expecting stiffness. Instead, the corpse shifted not naturally, but as if something inside it slid like a bag filled with liquid. Not organs, something rolled beneath. Her chest something heavy, something that should not exist. Burke recoiled so fast he slipped in the snow. The priest whispered, "The weight of a soul never meant to leave." That night, the priest locked himself in the church and would not come out for 3 days. Later that evening, the sheriff received a knock at his door. A young boy stood outside, trembling violently, holding a stack of papers bound by cloth. "Found these," he whispered, "in the doctor's shed." The boy fled before Burke could ask questions. The sheriff unfolded the cloth. Inside were notes, dozens of them written in ink, charcoal, and something that looked like soot from a chimney. The earliest notes were scientific: heat signatures of dying patients, measurements of breath pressure, pulse fluctuations seconds before death. The later notes devolved into madness. Burke read one entry aloud: "The weight changes when it approaches. Their souls become denser, that they fear the dark behind them." Another: "The collector cannot cross without a guide. I have become its guide." Burke felt something twist in his stomach. He turned to the last page, written in a shaking, feverish scrawl. "It promised my wife back. But what returned was not her. It does not know how to be human." Burke froze. The town believed Dr. Wren had never married. Wren never spoke of a wife. No obituary. No record. But then a final line sent ice through Burke's veins. "She stands in the corner now. She watches me sleep. She is cold." He flipped the page. The last words the doctor ever wrote were smeared. As if a trembling hand had dragged across the ink: "It grows hungry, and I grow hollow." On the following night, the coldest of the year, the sheriff did not return home. His wife, frantic, alerted the deputy. The deputy found the sheriff's tracks leading into the woods behind Marrow Street. He followed them with a lantern held high. Tree branches glistened with frost, like veins of frozen silver. The air was painfully still. Each breath burned the throat. And then the deputy stopped. Burke's tracks ended abruptly. No sign of a struggle. No drag marks. No blood. Just footprints leading forward. And then nothing. As if he had stepped off the earth itself. The deputy called out, voice shaking, "Sheriff, Sheriff, can you hear me?" The woods answered with a whisper. Not a natural whisper, a voice dragging through water. Measured. The deputy dropped his lantern and ran for his life. The sheriff was never seen again. But 3 days later, someone placed his badge on the church steps. And beside it lay a sheet of paper from the doctor's ledger. On it was written, "Subject 5, Thomas Burkwaite, taken." The ink was still wet. The townspeople had finally gathered the courage to storm the doctor's home. They broke the windows. They shattered the lock. They rushed inside with lanterns and pitchforks. The house was empty. No doctor. No figure in the window. But the upstairs lamp still burned. As they climbed the steps, the air grew colder, unbearably, impossibly cold. Frost bloomed across the walls and floor like creeping roots. The lamp flickered, and a shadow passed across the room. Not a man, not a creature, not anything that belonged to the world. It was thin, stretched, like a body made of smoke pulled too tight. It had no eyes, but they felt it watching, and it leaned toward them. The nearest man dropped to his knees, sobbing. The shadow opened what might have been a mouth and exhaled. The lantern flames bent toward it as if drawn by a vacuum. Every man in the room felt something wrench inside his chest, a tug, a pulled hand sliding around something deep within. The shadow whispered, a voice like a dying breath forced through wet cloth. "Measured." The lamp burst. Darkness swallowed the room. When the men scrambled out, not one dared look back. The next morning, the town set the Wren house on fire. But the flames burned unnaturally low, clinging to the walls like sickly orange moss. It took 3 barrels of kerosene before the structure finally collapsed into ash. And yet, that night, the upstairs window glowed. People screamed and hid in their homes. But the glow remained. Steady. Cold. Patient. As if the house remembered its shape. As if the shadow inside refused to be buried. The next day, the townspeople demolished the Tilly foundation. They dug up the soil. They salted the ground. They built a fence around the property. And still every night a faint light shimmered above the empty plot, hovering where the window once stood. Mrs. Holland swore she heard footsteps pacing through the empty air. The scale was gone, but the tapping continued. Faint. Measured. Tap, tap. 1 month later, in early April, a traveler passing through Ashford Hollow stopped at the fence surrounding the doctor's old lot. Some say the collector took him, some say he followed it willingly, and others whisper that, on certain nights, If you stand near the old Ashford Hollow site and hold your breath, you can hear two shadows moving in unison. One tall, one thin, one trembling. Measuring, weighing, judging, and neither of them casts a human shadow. By the summer of 1901, Ashford Hollow was a wounded animal living, breathing, but unable to rise. Families began fleeing without packing more than a day's worth of belongings. Horses were sold for half their worth. Children were dragged from their beds before sunrise. No one spoke openly about the reason. Those who stayed behind tried desperately to resume normal life. They reopened the mill for a few weeks. They patched the roofs. They fixed the church bell, which had cracked during the March cold snap, but nothing stayed fixed. The bell rope snapped when the pastor pulled it for Sunday service. The sawmill blades, dulled overnight with no explanation. Milk curdled in cold kitchens. Bread rose too fast or not at all. Lanterns dimmed without warning. Worst of all, the air itself felt. Watched. As if the town was a dying creature observed by something patient, something curious, something waiting for the final breath before claiming its weight. Mrs. Holland, who had watched the doctor's nightly rituals from her window, told her sister in Boston, "Ashford Hollow has become a place where the soul sinks. I fear leaving, but I fear staying more." She left the next day, walking to the train station without looking back. 6 others followed before nightfall. By autumn, the town had lost more than half its population, but the emptiness did not bring peace. It brought echoes. Even after residents fled, strange sounds persisted, sounds that did not belong in an abandoned valley. Travelers passing through the region on horseback or by wagon reported a lantern glow drifting across fields with no carrier. The distant hum of medical instruments. A tapping sound following them for miles. Footsteps pacing inside empty houses. Breathing not behind them, but beneath them, as if something walked under the ground. One traveler, a fur trader named Jeremiah Cobb, camped near the old schoolhouse. He later wrote in his logbook, "I awoke to find my campfire nearly smothered, though there was no wind. Then a whisper rose behind me, shaped like a word I did not know. It pressed on me like a hand. I fled, but my footsteps felt heavy, as though someone stepped inside them with me." He refused to travel through that valley again. Another traveler claimed he saw a thin man in a doctor's coat wandering the edge of the woods, barefoot, moving as if he were guided by invisible strings. When called out to, the figure turned, but it had no face. Not anymore. In 1903, 2 years after the town's abandonment, a group of scholars from Boston visited the remains of Ashford Hollow. They were investigating a series of regional folktales involving soul-measuring rituals and shadow physicians. They found the town overgrown, nature reclaiming each house with quiet determination. Windows shattered, roofs caved. The church steeple leaned dangerously to one side, but the strangest part was the air. It felt thick. Not mist, not heat, not humidity. Weight. They described a sensation like walking underwater, each step resisted by invisible hands. Instruments the scholars carried, pocket watches, barometers, and compasses, malfunctioned instantly. Time slowed, needles spun, metal warped. One scholar fainted. Another experienced chest pain so severe he begged to be carried out. A third dropped to his knees and whispered, "It's measuring us." They left before sunset. Their notes described no ghosts, no shadows, no physical threats. But all 3 agreed on one thing. They were being watched by something that hungered for things it could not yet reach. In 1908, the sheriff's ledger, long sealed in Boston police archives, was reviewed by a historian researching the medical practices of rural doctors in the turn-of-the-century Northeast. The historian was meticulous and skeptical, known for dismissing superstition, yet when he opened the ledger, he noted something odd. Every entry from Subject 1 to Subject 4 appeared aged. Ink faded to sepia, but the last line, the sheriff's own entry, was darker than fresh ink, as though it had been written moments before the ledger was opened. He also noticed something that chilled him. The bottom corner of the page was charred, as if burned from inside the paper outward. He wrote a note to his assistant. "If this is a forgery, it's the most convincing one I've ever seen." The handwriting seems to sweat. He sent the ledger for chemical analysis, but the analysis never happened. The document vanished from the archive the next week. In its place, the archivist found something else. A small brass scale weight. Cold. Too cold. And heavier than it should have been by several ounces. Someone wrote a single sentence beneath it on scrap paper: "The measure is never lost." By 1920, only one man remained in Ashford Hollow, Father Ellery Arnold, the pastor who had read the doctor's ledger firsthand. He refused to leave the valley, even as the church collapsed around him and the earth swallowed the graves behind the chapel. When a group of traveling surveyors found him still living there, they described him as gaunt, pale eyes, wide and unfocused hands. Trembling as though always cold, they asked him why he stayed in such a forsaken place. He answered, "To keep the weight from spreading." One surveyor laughed, thinking it a joke. The priest stared through him and whispered, "It lingers where the last measure was taken. If I leave, it will follow." They offered to take him out of the valley, but he refused so violently they backed away in fear. 4 months later, a hiker found Father Arnold lying in the old churchyard. He was dead, but not peaceful. His mouth was open, frozen in a silent scream, and frost rimmed his lips. His body weighed 3 times what it should have. The coroner wrote, "Impossible. This is impossible." But it wasn't impossible. Not for Ashford Hollow. Throughout the 20th century, hikers, hunters, and curious teenagers visited the old valley. Most found nothing but ruins, but some found footprints, long, narrow, unnaturally deep, as if whoever made them carried the weight of stone, not flesh. A pair of campers in 1964 followed a trail of such footprints until they noticed a strange detail. There were no prints leading into the trail, only leading out. As if the thing had appeared mid-step. They fled in opposite directions, abandoning their gear. One was never found. The survivor later told police, "It walks behind you without making tracks, but it presses down when it wants you to know it's there." Today, Ashford Hollow no longer exists on any official map. The valley is overgrown, the houses devoured by vines and time. But the air is still wrong there. Birds avoid it. Compass needles shiver. The earth feels heavy beneath the feet. If you walk the path leading to where Dr. Wren's home once stood, you'll notice something unsettling. The ground sinks slightly, like stepping onto a scale. Some say you can feel a tug behind your rib cage, gentle but unmistakable, like fingers curling around something deep inside you. Some hear breathing, some hear tapping, and a few, always at dusk, see a faint glow floating above the earth where the upstairs window once shone. Not bright. Not warm. Cold. Like moonlight filtered through water. Then comes the whisper, a single word, drawn out like breath, leaving a dying throat. Measured. Travelers never linger after hearing it. The wise ones don't return at all. And so the story of Dr. Elias Wren lingers heavy, cold, and alive. His fate remains unknown. His shadow remains unclaimed. His house remains gone, yet not gone. But some nights when the river freezes thin as glass, and the valley grows so quiet, it feels like the world has paused. A figure walks across the old Marrow Street lot. Barefoot. Slow. Measured. Sometimes it is tall. Sometimes thin. Sometimes drifting like smoke. And once in a great while, for those who are truly unlucky, you can see 2 figures, one leading, one following, pausing in silence before a faint glow that flickers like an eternal lamp. And in the cold, still air, something taps gently. Tap. 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 Weighing. Recording. Judging. Long after the living leave, long after the dead are gone, because the collector never stops, and neither does the weight of the soul.